Do you want me to record it as well?
Whoops, I guess we're good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. And we are here today, now that we have mastered all this technology, to talk about the ever popular topic of, what were we talking about, AP?
The original topic.
Oh, yeah, original topic. Yes. Thank you. The originality versus inspiration. And speaking of inspiration, I have had my own researcher doing some work, because my nemesis here has a researcher always coming up with this damning evidence. Well, a researcher came up with some. Here we go. There's nothing to show, but there is something to show, folks.
Screen sharing has stopped as the shared window. What? You have broken my computer.
Woohoo!
You know what, Philip? We'll have to start this again.
I have this evidence on my phone as well, so I'll just bring it up there.
There you go.
Oh, there is the evidence. Okay, so apparently my nemesis here is quite the singer. Hey diddle dillo. And not only did my researcher find this photograph of him singing, there's also some audio as well. Everyone have a listen.
In the black heart of Mala City, on a black night of blackness so dark, no one could see a thing, it was all gritty, when a guard cried out, but the darkness did not answer, because no one was there. Canavan was climbing the tower.
Please stop.
Instead of using the stair.
Oh dear. Well, it's AP Diddle Billow or Biddle or what?
Philip, let me say this from the bottom of my heart.
Yeah.
I hate you.
Well, you are quite the singer, so that was very wonderful that my researcher, and I should give credit to the researcher because I just pilfered the picture that he shared on Twitter without asking even. So thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Paul Van Dolewaert is the researcher who uncovered the photographic evidence and the audio that Professor Fireballs is in fact quite the bard.
I hate you so much.
So that's inspiring already. We're already on the topic of inspiration. And this is something that's come up a few times recently, the idea of, how derivative is the sort of pejorative way of putting it, something we call derivative. We usually mean that it's not well done, I suppose. But then we might say something is inspired by, and usually we mean a slightly more positive thing in that sense. But I wonder how meaningful the distinction is, and that's something we can talk about. Is this a meaningful distinction between things that are perhaps derivative, or things that are influenced by, or things that are inspired by other big source material? And there might be some nuances there that are important to acknowledge. But it's an interesting topic for those of us who are into fantasy. I think that it's fair to say that fantasy itself as a genre is very much inspired by source material. I think perhaps, and this is true of every genre of literature, frankly, but I think in fantasy, we almost revel in connections between newer works and older works, or even mythology and things like that. We enjoy it when a modern author engages in older mythology and older legend and material like that in a way that we find compelling and creative. So on the other hand, I think it's fair to say it can be handled badly, and it can be, there's a way, I guess, if we might put it pejoratively again as like ripping off something or something of that nature. So, and I suppose where someone draws the line, it depends on that person's perceptions and their experiences. If they're not familiar with the older material, they might not experience the newer thing as being derivative. until maybe it's pointed out to them. But so anyway, do you have any broad, AP, do you have any broad thoughts on this topic before we get into the nitty gritty?
Well, I think there are two major areas that actually you can start with. One is the terminology we use. As you alluded to, calling something derivative, you know, ostensibly it has been derived from, and you go, so it is derivative. But derivative is almost always intended as a pejorative. It has been inspired by, so this has served as an inspiration, but that's a much more positive term because it's lofty. But of particular interest, particularly with fantasy sometimes, is calling something generic, as in representative of the genre. And you go, oh, that's so generic. Well, I would hope so. It's meant to be a fantasy text. It should be of the genre. And it's, oh no, but I mean, it's too similar to, and that's the words we use having either positive or negative connotations, when quite often it's not necessarily a judgment call, but it's about whether or not we like it. And that's because we often conflate something we like with something good. So personal preference with an evaluative judgment, and something we dislike with something bad. So the language, the choice of words that we use, I think that is an interesting area to talk about some of the differences between them. And then the other sort of major aspect is, and I know some people get a bit on edge with it because I believe in death of the author, and don't get me started on a rant about people misunderstanding what death of the author means. But the author's intent in using the work, communicating the work, how it has been integrated into their work, what that means, because that's a whole bundle of different considerations. And that's before we get into the major sort of discussion, which is, why are we valuing originality? That's the big question. Do we value originality? And what do we mean by originality? Because that's the thing that's overshadowing all of this. Why is it that something that, oh, it's an original work, is valued more than this is derived from? And it's about this spark of creativity. And there's a whole lot of things that play into that. There's intellectual property and copyright and commodification and the capitalization and commodification of art as product and commercial product and all of these sorts of things. Like, they play into it, because ultimately a lot of what it comes down to, and as you pointed out, when we hear, oh, this is a new Robin Hood story, or here's a new Arthurian myth version, variant, a new telling of Arthurian myth, it's being told in a new way. Those are clearly derived from, inspired by, taking inspiration from, and elements of well-known texts. And despite that, we go, oh no, but it's in original packaging, that there's a separation. When we talk about Tolkien's work, everyone readily goes, oh, but Tolkien drew from these sources. And with fantasy, myth, legend, folklore, other fantasy texts, all of these different sort of aspects of history get woven into fantasy. We expect elements of copying, of these things being drawn in and put in and used in a new way. We expect elements of that, always expect elements of that. But we have this contrast, this juxtaposition of our desires, our stated desires. We want something original. Actually, we want something that is in a lot of ways very familiar.
So true. So to just illustrate this with some examples, and you mentioned Tolkien, who, by the way, as you said, had his influences. If you just compare the portrayal of the Huns and William Morris's The Roots of the Mountains, you will see very much the source of Tolkien's descriptions of orcs, and that's something that Tolkien openly acknowledged in his own letters. But Tolkien is certainly somebody who has, in turn, inspired lots of other writers. And the big duo, the two that I like to give as examples, and I don't know if I'm being completely fair, this is something I want to talk about, but the two examples that I've given several times And I think they're interesting because I believe they were both published in 1977. But one is Lord Fowl's Bane, written by Stephen Donaldson, which is influenced by Tolkien's fantasy, by the Lord of the Rings and so forth. It engages with an older work in a way that I find to be highly original, in a sense. I mean, he's doing something different. He's engaging with the older thing, you know, the idea of quest, but he's doing it for a purpose. I think Donaldson wanted it, and knowingly and consciously wanted to do something with that he's putting a different spin on, I think. And many people would read Lord Fowl's Bane would not even recognize that there's any Lord of the Rings at all in it. So I think that it's a good example of an author engaging with another author in a way that you have clearly inspiration there, but you also have something new being done in a way that is compelling and interesting. In contrast, also in 1977, is Terry Brooks's The Sword of Shannara, which to me, I read it when I was much younger. And as soon as I read it, I thought, okay, and I probably used the word derivative, but it was incredibly reminiscent of Lord of the Rings, to the degree that you have certain characters that correspond to the characters in Lord of the Rings. And it just seemed like, so as a kid, that seemed like so evident to me that I just thought, okay, well, I don't think I'm going to continue reading this series because I don't want to read something that's just a knockoff, you know. But I understand that Terry Brooks also went on to develop his own world and do his own thing later in that series. But Sword of Shannara itself, we can just limit it to that. As a kid, in my mind, it seemed very close in a way to Lord of the Rings, that as my young mind, it made me feel dismissive toward it. Maybe I would feel differently if I were to read it today. And I understand that too, because that was a time when people were looking for the next Lord of the Rings, you know. So Terry Brooks is not the only one to do that, as you well know. So
oh yeah, make me sad to get me in trouble again.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things about this, so think of the number of authors who and showrunners and creative types who saw Game of Thrones. They didn't necessarily read A Song of Ice and Fire. They didn't read the book A Game of Thrones. They saw the show A Game of Thrones and went, I can do something like that. And they were inspired by it. And they went, so what are the constituent elements that I need to put in this so that people who like that thing will like the thing that I'm creating?
Right.
And this, I think, sometimes can be where we can draw or put a wedge between what is inspiration and what is derivation. Because when Donaldson wrote Lord Fowl's Bane, it is very much in conversation with. It's like, this earlier work exists. I know everyone has read this earlier work.
Right.
And I'm now going to use that as a source to go and address aspects of what fantasy can do.
Mm-hmm.
Because that has inspired me. So he wears a white gold ring. And I'm, oh, a gold ring, eh? That's magical. Oh, where did you get that idea? And you go, where do you think Tolkien got it? It's not original to Tolkien.
It goes way back to, you could go to the Volsung Saga and other places, yeah.
But Donaldson, no, and again, this is not to deride Tolkien's work, but Donaldson takes a lot of it in a very psychological direction. Right. The literalization of metaphor, of dealing with trauma through the internal landscape of the mind, forming the external fantasy landscape, which is so radically different from the approach that Tolkien took, that you go, even if they are using the same constituent elements, they are creating something that is tonally different, is going in different directions, is trying to do different things, is exploring different things. And you go, so the inspiration here is, that has made me think about this thing in a new way. I'm going to use, say, superficial elements of that, but I'm creating an entire different subtext, an entire different meta text, an entire different approach to what this fiction is doing. So that is very clearly, yes, Tolkien did this thing. I was inspired by it, and I'm going to do my own version. But it is entirely unique to Donaldson. If there are those elements that, yes, he took from Tolkien, but Tolkien took from elsewhere, or Donaldson brings in elements from other authors he'd read. But when we look at Brooks, just that first book, because yes, his series develops in different directions, and he takes the reins and he takes it off into something that is uniquely his. But with that first book, it wasn't so much, oh, I'm going to do my own thing with it. It's like, I have the Lord of the Rings, so I'm going to tell that story again. And that's slightly different. That's not the same as I've been inspired to create this new narrative. It's the same narrative, changing the names of recognizable characters, having the sequences to and achieve a simple, and it's going to sound terrible, and I don't mean it to be this way, but to achieve something that is a simplified form of what Tolkien did. It was much more about the adventure in that first book. It's closer to Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings than The Lord of the Rings itself, that first book.
That's a fair observation, I think. Yeah. Because
Jackson did much the same thing. He took The Lord of the Rings and he distilled it down, and he flattened out a lot of the themes. He removed a lot of the sequences to make it more streamlined, to make it more adventure focused, to make it more action focused. And you can see that's what Brooks did. And Brooks did it because, he loved The Lord of the Rings and he wanted a faster, more action version of it. But because in terms of intention and because of what he was doing with it, it is so close to the original that's where when we read it, we feel it is a mere derivation of, that it is playing in the margins of the greater work rather than creating a work itself from the same constituent elements.
Right, that is correct. And it's interesting though, because what you said earlier is so true. I think it's a fairly modern obsession, if we can put it that way, this idea of originality. And there were authors, many of which are considered to be among the greats, who would have done something similar to what Terry Brooks did. But if, back
Shakespeare.
in Shakespeare, Chaucer, you name it. I mean, prior to the concept of copyright and of, in the development of capitalism, pretty much every author would not have hesitated to probably what we would call plagiarize now. So Chaucer translated passages from French and Italian poets and stuck the translation right into his own work. And, nobody blinked an eye at it. It was just, it's just, that's what people did back then, because stories were communal property. They weren't private property. So it's about, really, I said capitalism, I meant it. It's not, it's the concept of a story belonging to someone is an offshoot of capitalism in a way, that we monetize stories, therefore they have to belong to somebody. They have rights over this story. Would have been a completely foreign concept to Shakespeare, who borrowed every single plot for his plays except for two. So yeah.
You say borrowed.
Yeah, I mean, he did put his own stamp on those stories, of course.
But here's an interesting thing, because obviously, you can have maybe like, so Marlowe and Shakespeare being contemporaries, and it's like Marlowe puts on a play and Shakespeare's like, right, I'm going to do exactly the same play, but I'm going to do it better. And so he takes the same story and basically tries to outdo Marlowe.
Sure.
And Marlowe's like, right, he stole that. Well, I'm going to translate this thing. And then Shakespeare, well, I'm going to translate it. And it was a rivalry to create this. But one of the fascinating things, I think, that we've lost in the modern day because of the complete change in how we consume media, is so much was in the way it was told, the originality. So if you think of something like the Iliad, it wasn't that Homer was this one person who wandered around and it was, oh, look, Homer's in town, do the Iliad, play Freebird. There would have been multiple people who would be storytellers who would recite the Iliad.
Absolutely.
And it would go, well, are they any good? No, they were rubbish. You should hear Homer's version of the Iliad, or you should hear Aristophanes' version of the Iliad, or whatever, like whoever it was, that the performance of the text was everything. And it wasn't that they were doing word for word rote regurgitation of a set text. It was they had the framework and they used that framework to do their own version of the story. And we see that in all of these different oral storytelling traditions, even if, you know, the Iliad is not a good example of this because, you know, we have a set text now. But if you go into any of these oral storytelling traditions, and Iceland kept the saga tradition going longer than any other country in Europe. Ireland has a long, rich history of oral storytelling. And they go, here's the myth. And you go, but the myth told by O'Shaughnessy over there is better than the myth version that Murphy tells. And it's the same myth, but in the telling of it, in the performance of it, in how they weave it together, in how they pick out certain details and connect them to other details. That was what made the story original, even though a lot of the constituent elements that we now regard as the fundamentals of narrative are the same. So the narrative events might be the same. The characters might be the same. Even the story and plot, i.e. the narrative events, and depending on the sequencing of them, could be exactly the same. But the atmosphere created could have been entirely different. And if you think a horror version of a story is very different than a comedy version of a story, and it could be exactly the same story, but you emphasize things in a different way, and you suddenly have two different narratives because they're doing different things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very foreign to our minds. And I mentioned a book the other day when we were celebrating your 5K, your live stream. And I talked about Walter Ong's Orality and Literacy, which is a great place to go to. It's an older book and it's probably been superseded by more modern scholars, but it's sort of like when I was studying this stuff in grad school, it was sort of the go-to place to look at the difference in mindsets between a person growing up in an oral formulaic culture versus a person growing up in a literate culture. And the idea of fixedness being central to the literate culture. So fixedness being, this is the story. It is written down. It doesn't change, right? But in an oral formulaic culture, as you said, there is a performance. And the performance is not going to be exactly the same every time. It's not that, at least my understanding of the way most oral formulaic bards work is that it's not something they've memorized from beginning to end. It's more a matter of plugging in their formulaic lines, and they change their performance depending on the mood. It looks like the audience is getting bored. I need to really spice up this part, or, if they're really into it, let's elongate this performance another hour or so. So let's go on this little tangent or elongate this fight scene or whatever, every performance is a different thing. We tend to think of things like the Iliad and the Odyssey as fixed text because we have a version of those stories copied down. We're very fortunate to have a version of those stories copied down. But before that ever happened, these stories lived again and again and again in the mouths of the bards and in the minds of the audience. And they all would have known these stories. And they were communal property. And it was just as you said, it wasn't so much, nobody admired the bard for, oh, well, that's a really original version of the Odyssey. No, but they would have admired, that's a really well-told, performance of the Odyssey. So very different mindset. And when you go from a purely oral formulaic culture to something in between where you've introduced literacy, but let's say the majority of the population is still illiterate, and medieval Europe, basically, is what I'm talking about. You have literate, usually Christian monks who are sometimes, in the case of like Beowulf, for example, I have to mention Beowulf. In the case of Beowulf, you have basically a hybrid kind of story where clearly the Christian bard, or Christian monk rather, took material story stuff from much older tradition. We know this because the troll killing and mommy killing episode, we have analogs to this in Old Norse. So it's an old story that goes way, way back. It was told many, many times. But this Christian Christian monk took this story and repurposed it and put it into this narrative about the past and the Christian looking back on his pagan ancestors. And he probably tacked on the whole dragon killing episode where Beowulf dies. Spoiler for Beowulf. So basically, there's a hybrid creation here because it still exhibits many of the facets of oral formulaic storytelling, which is very appositional. It proceeds by putting on, Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, the great warrior, the mighty hero, blah, blah, blah. And then, you get something that he finally does. So it's very appositive. It's very associative as well in a storytelling form. Like I was saying, the bard might be telling the story of Beowulf and then, oh, I need to insert a hero story here to compare to Beowulf. So they'll go off for a few minutes telling about Sigmund the Dragon Slayer or whatever, and we'll work that stuff in. So the poem we have, which was produced by a literate individual at some point, probably maybe in the 8th century, is a hybrid creation. And it exhibits many of the facets of oral formulaic storytelling, but there's literacy's clearly been introduced into the equation. So this is a unique version of the story. But at that point, still, I think even literate people would not have recognized, like we said, all the way to Shakespeare's time, people were still taking stories from other people, repurposing them, taking stuff from here or there, doing their own versions. Nobody owned the story. That is a very modern concept. Probably, and I should research this, but I'm guessing the idea of copyright on a story originated in the 18th century at the earliest, but certainly by the 19th century, it's a thing, right? And of course, it's when you monetize it. It's when you make it the property of an individual. So, and
also like things like the printing press and the availability of multiple copies of the same thing, that it wasn't just some scribe with a vellum scroll etching this out, taking forever to get one. You could make multiple copies, and then those copies could be distributed. So not only the printing press, widespread education, the ability to deliver stories. So the evolution of the train. So something like having a serialized story in a magazine that was, say, in a paper, and it came out on Monday and was sent by train from London to Edinburgh, and people the same day could read it.
Right.
Suddenly there was an aspect of it. Or the lending libraries of London, where they would someone would get the book and they would read to everyone else. And so you had, instead of professional storytellers, you had a lot of amateur storytellers who were using the fixed work, because that's where the originality was, that's where the power was. And they read it to others. That there are a lot of different influences in what has shaped our perception of what story is and how we perceive it and how we consume it.
Right.
And technology, the change in technology is a massive one. The printing press, the availability of text, all of these things, coupled with literacy of schools. So like, instead of, all kids being sent out to be chimney sweeps the way they should, to go and earn a living to support their parents, we started sending children to school to go and learn things, and I miss having my chimney swept by a little Victorian cherub with sooty cheeks.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. You're absolutely right about the importance of the printing press and wider literacy. All of that has led to where we are now, where I think we pretend that something can be much more original than it is. So from the perspective of a modern writer, we talked about, Donaldson versus Brooks earlier. But the truth of the matter is, sort of like in the older oral formulaic cultures, we have all these stories going on in our heads that we've consumed and during our lives. From a writer's perspective, I think if you're going to be quite honest about it, I think you're going to acknowledge that a lot of what comes out when you write, whether you plan or whether you're a gardener or as a writer or whatever, a lot of what comes out has been prompted on some level, conscious or deep down in your subconscious, by the stories that you've already consumed. And you may not even realize it as you're writing, or you may. Either way, it doesn't matter, in my opinion. A lot of what you're writing is a product of the stories that you have already consumed. Whether they could be screen stories too, by the way, that are working their way into your writing and all kinds of things. I think there's this sort of myth of the author as being this, having this divine muse, and that it just sort of, like, it's sort of like the conceit that Milton had about himself. So by Milton's time, even, okay, in the 1600s, he had this whole idea about himself, and he was quite big on himself, being this grand, I'm going to write the best epic ever, right? And
it's a very short-sighted goal that he had.
Ooh, oh dear, poor Milton. He deserves
Milton jokes for the crowd at the back. There you go.
Yeah, we go. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, he could conceive of himself as being this genius individual, and but his story is incredibly derivative. I think it was told already, right? And this other book, what was it called? Oh yeah, the Bible, right?
The Bible.
Yeah.
I've heard tell of the Bible. Really Good and Kind has a review of the Bible.
And he ripped off, the very stories that he sort of poo-pooed in the course of writing. My epic is so much better than these, and let me do exactly what they did. I'll compare the fallen dead to the leaves of autumn. He was ripping off Virgil and Homer left and right, in Paradise Lost. So the fact of the matter is, I think we don't openly acknowledge as much as we could. And there are some authors who are very open about their inspirations. But the fact is, what comes out of you as a storyteller, even today in our highly literate era, where, yeah, you have the opportunity to put your own spin on a story because you're writing it down and you're tweaking it and all of that, but it's still very much, you're oozing out, all of your influences. Hopefully, maybe that was not the best way to put it.
I'm going to say, you heard it here first, folks. Authors ooze, coming straight from Dr. Philip Chase. But you raised two really good points there. One, obviously, the anxiety of influence. Harold Bloom wrote about this.
Yeah.
Because you read these stories, and well, okay, a lot of what Bloom was talking about was poetry, but same thing applies to any form of narrative and fiction and all these sorts of things. You read this and you go, I want to be able to do that. And you're inspired by, look at their style, look at how they do this, look at their turn of phrase. So you start out quite often in imitation.
Yeah.
Look at the number of people who they write Elizabethan sonnets. You mean, you're copying what Shakespeare did.
Right.
But starting out that way and going, I have my template and I'm going to practice it until I know the template. And then I'm going to adapt it. And then I'm going to I get so adept at it that I will adapt it to my own needs. And suddenly creativity goes off in a new direction. It's a bit like when people talk about the rules of fiction. It's, you learn the rules first so you know when and how to break them and what breaking them will do.
Precisely.
And the anxiety of influence, I think, is very real because you want to be like your heroes. You want to be like those greats that you admire that inspired you, but you also want to be distinct. You want to have your own voice.
Right.
And I think like all artists have an aspect of that. Artists who are inspired by, they go and they look at, say, Picasso, and they're stunned by what Picasso did. So they they practice what Picasso did, and then they get their own take on it. But one of the interesting things, obviously, about narrative is patterns and structure, the stuff that I'm so intrigued by. Because when we think of genre is a codified form of forms, tropes, structures that are expected within a certain oeuvre. That we have gathered all of it. And if you think about the range of different stories in fantasy, you have tragedies, you have comedies, so you could divide it that way. You have tragic comedies, you have dramas, you can have slice of life fantasy, you can have cozy fantasy, you can have military fantasy, you can have all of these. You go, what's joining all of these together? And it's a shared set of ingredients. And we start thinking about the different elements that come together. And the originality like going back to some of the other stuff that we're talking about, a lot of the originality is putting those elements together in a new way. And
Right.
I don't know about you, but there were a lot of stories that I read when I was younger. And I went, if I was writing this story, like I start a sentence in my head, if I was writing this story, this is where I would take it. And that is the beginning of creating something new, that you're working solely on. And you know, people have fan fiction where they set stories in the world, or they do something different with the characters. And those are original stories. They're just using someone else's creation.
Yeah.
But that's the beginning of finding your own way to tell a story. And one of the writing techniques that people have used is look at a short story or something written by someone, and you sit down and you write it out word for word. You are copying it word for word. And as soon as you fall into the rhythm of just copying it, and then you sort of go, well, the next word should be, and you deviate from it, that's when you start. So the first 2-3 paragraphs might be identical, but suddenly you slip into the mind of that style, and you go off in a different direction, but still in the same style. And it's a way to practice stylistic techniques.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we see all of this. So when people say this text is generic, sometimes I know when people say it, they mean, oh, it's bland, it's unoriginal, we've seen this a million times before.
Right.
And yet, a story well told can be the most familiar story in the world. But if it is well told, if it holds your attention, if it engages you, if it draws you in, it doesn't matter if every syllable in that is recognizable, depending on how it's being told. How many times have we had a Little Red Riding Hood story? And you go, you know, almost beat for beat what's going to happen in it. But when someone takes Little Red Riding Hood and they do something fun with it or something different with it, and you go, wow, this is great. Or they take a bunch of fairy tales and they put a detective down hunting through all of the fairy tale murders, because fairy tales are kind of dark. But you recognize all of the stories. You know all of these characters, and yet suddenly it's in this completely new way of doing it.
Right.
A story well told can be its own reward.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And it's interesting because the way I spoke about it before, I almost probably made it sound like there are only 2 ways to do it. You have Donaldson versus Brooks, but really there are many other ways to engage with a source of influence or inspiration. You could consciously reject somebody, like let's say Michael Moorcock did with Tolkien. I mean, there's another way of looking at how you interact with your predecessors. There's a conscious rejection of Tolkien in Moorcock's work, right?
And in China Miéville's work, one of the Scar by China Miéville, one of the Bas Lag novels, and it's almost like the anti-quest quest. If in what you imagine a traditional quest is that they would turn right, China Miéville will turn left.
Yeah.
Any decision that you think is the decision a quest group would make, they will do the opposite thing. And it's so, and that is a massive oversimplification of how good China Miéville's writing is. But when you think about it that way, it is just as someone who is doing that, who is absolutely rejecting the thing, is just as engaged as someone who is affirming it.
Right.
Because you're taking exactly the same story, and instead of repeating it, you're doing the opposite of it. And you go, the same original story is still there as the thing that is defining your narrative. Only now it is in the negative space rather than in the positive space.
Yep. So I'm going to, instead of having elves who are beautiful, graceful, lovely, ethereal people, my elves are going to be substance abusing, jaded, and world weary. You're still engaging with what came before when you consciously reject it, and maybe even subconsciously it's creeping in places where you don't even realize, I think. So yeah.
But one last point is some of this stuff, I think, and I know it's unpopular to take in authorial intent because people go, oh, death of the author. But when it comes to what an author is doing, if an author sits down and goes, oh, so-and-so is really good, I'm just going to copy their work, we generally and genuinely have far less sympathy for that than someone who is, they're sitting writing and they've drawn from other books and they haven't realized they've done it because they've been writing in their world and they go, oh, you know, it would be perfect if this thing happened. And then, you know, someone like you or me or any number of readers comes on and go, oh, that must be an homage to that author because I remember that in that book. And the author that you're talking about is just gone,
oops.
You know what? You're right. That does look suspiciously like the thing. I hadn't realized I'd done that.
Yeah.
And that, you know, in having spoken to authors, sometimes that happens that they go, I didn't realize because I was looking at that sequence and it was the natural fit. And you go, we fall into patterns.
That's the oozing. That's the oozing.
The gumbo of story, the cauldron of story with all of these ingredients. Yeah. And sometimes we don't realize that what we've done is we've picked up a fragment of someone else's story.
Right.
And we've placed it in because it fits so perfectly with that little aspect. But there's a difference between modeling your entire narrative on someone else's work and copying it and doing a sketch of their work and go, here's my story that's entirely original, and not acknowledging the influence,
right?
And someone else who has small elements here and there that have crept in and gone, I didn't realize I'd done that, or even, yeah, I did. That is so-and-so. They are brilliant. Go and read their entire book. I stole that one tiny bit because I loved it so much, or that one phrase. And it's not the whole sentence. It's one phrase of theirs. And I went, I'm nicking that.
Yeah.
And the authors that do that quite generally, when they're talking in interviews, they go, oh yeah, you should go and read so-and-so because they're fantastic. That's where I got that. And they love the engagement with it because they love stories. That's why they're authors. They love stories as much as we as readers love stories.
Absolutely.
And they want readers to find more.
The word there, my friend, your favorite word, homage. So, well, I think we've covered this pretty well. I'm sure there are going to be some great comments. So first, I'd like to thank you, my good friend. This has been, this is a topic that's very interesting for me. It's something that I've thought about a lot over the years, both as a reader and somebody who writes as well. And it's fun for me personally to tease apart my own writing and find the things that I've unconsciously have found their way in. And certainly some things are most deliberately put in there as well, you know, from Old English to modern writers. I mean, I have definitely got my fair of homages in my own writing. So I'm gonna have it, just right in the margins. Is this homage or are you outright stealing, you thief? Nefarious thief. So yes, but anyway, thank you so much, AP. I always enjoy our chats. And thank you also to all of you people who have been listening to us.
Well, thank you very much. And Philip, it is always a pleasure. And I thank your audience as well for putting up with me.
I'm sure they had a great time. All right, my friend, take care.